100% of the greenhouse gas emissions growth is projected to happen in emerging markets. So if we're going to solve climate, we cannot ignore emerging markets.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Sober Mesa Podcast. With us today, we have Emily McAteer, co-founder and CEO of Odyssey Energy Solutions. Emily is the first of hopefully many female founders we have on the show, and we'll cover her unique perspective on women-led startups, fundraising tips, and more. I also wanted to bring Emily on the pod to do a bit of a mini masterclass on energy, and hopefully you'll come out with a better understanding on everything clean tech, electrification, renewable energy, and a lot of these buzzwords that we hear every day. And we'll wrap up with the role of Odyssey in emerging markets, particularly in Africa, which is, as we'll see, a key factor in reducing the fossil fuel emissions if we want to get serious about climate change. So get ready. There's a lot of information to cover in the next half hour or so. Hope you enjoy. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I didn't realize I'm the first female founder you've had on the show.
You are. So we'll delve a little bit deeper into that. We'll have others as well, but I think we'll have a good discussion around that topic as well. But let's start from the beginning, Emily. You were born and bred in the energy space. Can you share with us how you got started? I'm sure you had a lot of energy discussions at your family dinner table as well.
Yeah, it's always a little bit embarrassing. In some ways, what's the phrase? The bird hasn't flown far from the nest.
Yeah.
But both of my parents worked in energy and climate. So grew up, my father worked for utility doing energy efficiency, and my mother worked for the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the U.S. Government agency. So I grew up talking about electricity grids, talking about climate, sort of from day one, and it was kind of always since then in my plan that I would work in climate and energy. So yeah, it goes way back.
And we're gonna delve deeper into a lot of the technicalities and whatnot, but just to get it out of the way, what's Odyssey in a nutshell? What's the gist of it? And maybe if you want to use some examples or whatever you think it's easiest to explain what it is, and then we'll pivot a little bit and come back to it towards the end.
Yeah. So high level, Odyssey is a software platform to scale deployment of distributed renewables, primarily in emerging markets. So we have a platform that covers planning projects, financing them, procuring equipment, and then operating assets. And maybe I'll leave it there because we're going to have plenty of time to break that down and talk about what that means.
Yeah. So as I said in the beginning, you're the first female founder guest in the show. And so I think you can, and I've heard you speak about the topic before, and I think you bring a very unique, maybe even controversial perspective on some regards. And it's good to have this discussion in a more long form, as it is in a podcast, as opposed to a blog post, which might get things out of context. So would love to hear your story on how you went about fundraising. And as we know, kind of the setup is a tiny fraction of VC money goes to women-led startups or only women-led startups. Yet here you are with tremendous success from that perspective. The last round being led by tier 1 VC like Union Square Ventures, that's surrounding which we participated at FJ. And so you were very successful from that regard. Anything that you think you did differently or you think that set you up for success if you can share some tips or tactics, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious what I've said in the past that might be controversial. I don't know if I have super controversial opinions on this, but it might be helpful actually to back up. And, I wouldn't say I'm sort of like a natural entrepreneur. I was not one of those people that I went to business school. I went to Stanford Business School. There, you get there and there's just people that know that they're in business school to start a company and to do entrepreneurship. And I was definitely not one of those people. So I embarrassingly did not take a single entrepreneurship class at Stanford. And I remember when I was building a couple of years ago, I was building like a financial model for Odyssey and just kicking myself that I didn't take startup finance at Stanford because that would have been so much easier if I knew what I was doing. But I'm a very sort of execution focused person, and my superpowers are all around like, how do you take a big problem, break it down into bits and pieces, get good processes in place, and go execute? And so I always thought that personality type didn't jive with being an entrepreneur. I thought if you like entrepreneurs had to be blue sky thinkers and, you know, big vision people. And I was always kind of suited to either be in a more structured environment or like, you know, the operating partner to someone who is like that. So so not only like am I sort of, I guess if you think about sort of patterns that, you know, I was up against being a woman trying to raise money, which is, you know, the stats are not great on that front, but then also just being someone that didn't think of themselves as a natural entrepreneur. So it definitely took a lot of kind of practice and also I guess sort of reframing for myself about like what makes a good entrepreneur, because what I've learned over the years is entrepreneurs come in all different flavors, and the superpowers that I have are really important for running a company and have what sort of made Odyssey is today. So that's kind of a long preamble, but I think it ties to my experience fundraising because you know, the known sort of research on women in the workplace generally is that women, you know, don't apply for a job, for example, unless they check all of the check boxes that are listed in the job description. And fundraising is really similar, right? Like my instinct is like, okay, we've done XYZ and we need to, you know, like we won't fundraise until we've, you know, 100% proven that we have product market fit and we're off. And actually fundraising, especially the early stage, is much more about like, hey, we have early indicators and really think we're on the right path, but like we wouldn't be at seed or we wouldn't be at Series A if we 100% knew that this is going to work out, right? And so I had to sort of wrestle with that and learn how to kind of equally weight sort of granular details about where we were with the sort of big opportunity we were chasing in vision, because the opportunity is just so massive, and that's a big part of like what the bet that investors are making.
And how do you do that concretely? Let's say because what I'm hearing right now is there's an element of you being very structured that seems to have helped throughout the fundraising process, and maybe we'll get deeper into that in a bit. But also there were some doubts and maybe self-imposed doubts that some founders might have on themselves that you have to overcome in order to, you know, you have the biases against you and the stats against you, and if you add to that sort of self-insecurities, that's, you know, not a perfect combo. So how do you actually overcome those sort of self-biases and actually go ahead and put yourself out there?
I think it was refining the pitch to sort of lead with the opportunity, and a little bit of education about what we are trying to do, because most investors don't come in knowing a ton about the energy opportunity in emerging markets. And so I was sort of taking that for granted, and I'd come in and just get really granular and like where we are today and where we're going. And it really helped when I sort of took a step back and reminded every investor I was talking to about like, hey, here's the big picture here. Like, we're talking about energy infrastructure, right? That's not going away. And we're talking about it in a place where trillions of dollars of energy infrastructure is going to be built in a very specific way that we are basically catalyzing. So really, yeah, it came down to remembering to provide that context in the beginning. And I think that really set me up to then do what I do best, which is talk about Odyssey and where we are and what our plan is and what we're executing on. So yeah, I think that was a big piece of it. And practice. Yeah. I mean, I had great seed investors that helped me get comfortable sort of with the whole process and made it a lot easier.
What about before that?
Run
What about
Series A.
before you had investors? I have a lot of female founders and friends and people that ask me, hey, if you ever have a female guest on the show, ask them about, you know, resources, how they've done it, how they go about it. Who did you practice with to get those seed investors in the first place?
Pre-seed. Yeah. Business school friends.
Yeah, whoever you can get a hold of.
Yeah, whoever I could kind of like get to listen to me. And one of my seed investors uses a great analogy that fundraising is kind of like wandering in the desert, and you don't even know if you're going to find water, but then as soon as you do, you find a water park. That was definitely our seed experience. Like, just so many conversations, so uncertain what was landing, what wasn't. But then, you know, when we found the fit with our lead, it was like, I mean, we just knew that they were right for us and we were right for them, and things became a lot easier from there. So,
Emily, and there's a saying that goes something like, "Tell me a story, not statistics." But in this case, the opposite is also true, right? Your story is amazing, and again, from a fundraising perspective, you raised tens of millions of dollars, but the statistics going back, there's still only 2% of female-led. Female-led, I mean 100%, because if there's a woman and a man, there's the percentage is higher. But like, where do you see that disconnect, or what's your main reason in your view that these things still happen? Like, where's the disconnect, and what can we do about it?
Well, I do think it's a bit of a lagging indicator. Like I would guess that number is changing.
Yeah.
And because for the reasons I was just talking about, where you know, the stats or the research shows that women tend to be like a little bit more practically grounded. Like, if you're applying for a job, which is the same thing as applying for funding for your company, it's like, do I have this credential? Do I have this criteria? And there, when the VC market was super frothy and everything was based on kind of vision and promise, you could probably do better if you were just sort of painting sort of the big picture and not grounding your pitch in numbers and plans and all of that. And that's definitely, I mean, there's just a lot more focus these days on what's actually been achieved and what do those early data points say about the potential for the business. So I would guess that the changing kind of VC landscape is moving in correlation with probably more female founders getting funded. That, and I would say, I don't know if have you ever seen a breakdown of like what climate founders and what percentage female? Because I think I would guess too. I mean, climate's just one of those things that it's sort of this all hands on deck approach, and I've seen stats that at least the percentage of female representation in the renewable energy sector is higher than in overall energy sector, and I would guess it's probably similar for founders in the climate tech sector. So as we just see, yeah.
There's a couple of things to mention here, and this is it's not controversial, but this is the interesting piece to mention. I think we can stay there and talk about the 2% all day long, but I think we should also cherish the wins, quote unquote, cherish the wins with cases like yourself, because then if I'm a female founder, I'm thinking of potentially doing it, but I see all of these bleak statistics, and I'm going to probably be discouraged in some capacity. But if I see the success cases out there, and if I feel that there's a change underway, then I'm most likely to try. And so I think that's a positive thing. And
yeah,
there are other positive statistics. I think I was mentioning before, the combination of female and male founders went up from 6% in 2008 to all-time high right now, which is 18%. Again, a long way to go. But I also totally agree with you that this might be, again, it's so tough to measure, but this might be a lagging indicator, maybe a coincident indicator at best. Just think about the total VC money. Most of that is late stage, and the late stage companies were funded 5-10 years ago when the climate for women-led startups was completely different. So I think we might see a change, hopefully, fingers crossed, in the future. And that combined with an influx of VC women, with most of my VC friends are women, and I think that helps change the underlying biases. And so I'm cautiously optimistic about the change on the way.
Yeah, I always feel obligated to tell my Series A fundraising story. It's not fun to relive, but I launched our Series A in my first trimester of my third pregnancy. I have a baby due just in a few weeks now, and I was really, really sick doing it. Like basically the exact timeline in which, you can be really sick from pregnancy correlated with the 6 weeks or so that, I was pitching all the time and needing to be totally on my game. And I have some pretty not fun stories of, needing to like throw up in between pitches and like lots of not fun stuff, but like I survived it, and like to tell the story because it's a reminder of like, yeah, this was a really real thing that I had to deal with that a male counterpart wouldn't have to, like there's just no way around it. And there were days that I woke up and just felt the injustice of it, but at the same time it was like I raised a Series A while still in the family building phase. I've had 3 kids all in the course of building Odyssey, or I guess I have my third coming, but I will have had 3 kids all in the course of building Odyssey. And it's possible, and it's possible because of a lot of it because of sort of the hybrid remote work culture now. I took, pretty short maternity leaves, both kids, like few weeks I was off and that was about it, which is not, not ideal and not common, but it always felt okay because I could kind of like be back, but also, be near my kids when they were born. And because I was working mostly remote. And so I think that there's things that just weren't possible before for female founders or for female executives that are now possible because of embracing the remote culture.
Emily, let's shift gears and talk about this mini masterclass, and we can take this wherever we want. But the setup is, again, we have a lot of people in common, a lot of investors, a lot of friends, a lot of people in tech that might know about energy, might get excited on energy topics, but maybe they don't fully grasp some of the basics, or they don't really can connect all of the dots around different mega trends around the big energy space. So maybe let's take a step back and try to uncover some of the basic concepts on energy, and then we can talk about some of the mega trends and how do they relate to each other. And let's also separate developed markets with developing markets. I think that'd be helpful. But starting from, I'm based in and sitting here in New York, you're in Colorado. Where is the energy from my AC or my mic here coming from? Like, what's the setup in a developed country?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful to kind of understand the work that we do in energy development, starting with how energy infrastructure gets developed, and it got developed and now gets developed. So if you're sitting here in the US, you've got primarily really big power plants that generate energy, and some of those are renewable, right? Wind and solar, but a lot of them are fossil fuel based. They connect into a utility grid, and then that utility grid takes a ton of power from this one source and spreads it all over the country. And then all the way down to, the distribution cable. So there's transmission, which sort of spreads it really far, right? Those are the big cables that energy is running through. And then it steps down into what we call distribution, which brings it a little bit closer to your home. And then there's the cable that's bringing it to you and your mic's working. So we call that a central utility grid. What's interesting is that as we've tried to decarbonize our grid, right, as we've tried to move away from fossil fuels, we've done it in two ways. One, we've built large renewable energy power plants that feed into the grid. But the challenge is you have to have, because the sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing, and you
that's important, Emily, because a lot of people take for granted that the energy powering this mic most likely is coming from natural gas or oil, non-renewable, right? And I might have my compost and feel good about energy, whatever, but most likely most of the things that are powering my apartment right now are coming from fossil fuels. And that seems obvious, but it's not really obvious. And just a little digression here. There's a book that I really recommend called How the World Really Works. I don't know if you've heard of it, but I think it has this sort of very graphic comparisons. They talk about like a supermarket bought tomato, and that it packs like 5 tablespoons of diesel on its production. And so just very graphic, just slicing your tomato, you can go to the fridge and think about 1, 2, 3, 5 tablespoons of diesel, and things that you never think about. And it's super, super graphic. And so we're really dependent on fossil fuels, and that's how hard this problem is.
Yeah. And one of the reasons it's so hard is because we have really good technologies for solar and wind, but they're what we call intermittent, right? So if you have a central utility grid, you always need to be matching power supply and demand, right? That's the challenge, because the only way you can really store energy is through energy storage solutions like big batteries. And when we're talking about a huge utility grid across the whole US, that is a lot of batteries. That's a lot of storage, and that's been a big sort of technology challenge. So if it's hard to store energy, then having energy kind of fluctuate on one side, right? Having wind coming online and solar shining and then not shining becomes really hard. To then also have the demand to match that. So we are integrating tons of renewables into the grid, and that's one of the reasons and one of the ways that we are trying to decarbonize the central utility grid. But then the other thing we're doing is integrating what we call distributed renewables, and that's the world in I work. Distributed renewables basically means a very small power plant right in the place of whoever's using that power. So best example, like the solar on a house, right? Distributed renewable, like the house is using that solar. And then we're trying to, in the US, what we're in other developed markets, what we're doing is we're trying to integrate that into our central utility grid so that we can, send it back into the grid and have it power somebody else if I'm not using the full solar on my roof.
Is that the best way? Is there a bit of path dependency on, hey, the US and other developed markets started with a centralized grid, and now as we decarbonize and try to decentralize energy, then we need to plug into the centralized solution? Or if you could build it from scratch, would you start it that way? And maybe we can pivot to some of the work you're doing in,
That's a great pivot to how it's working in emerging markets, because what's exciting and unique about the markets where we work is that the central utility grid is either undeveloped, like doesn't even exist in certain places, or is underdeveloped in that there's more supply than the grid basically has been built out to provide. Which means the downside of that, it means that we have poor, what we call energy access or energy reliability, right? So if you're living in Nigeria, if you're living in rural Nigeria, for example, you might not have the grid at all. No, you have no power. Or if you're living in Lagos, the power is going out all the time because the grid is just not built to support the level of demand that economic and population growth have created. So that's the downside. But the positive is that we have this opportunity to do things right from scratch, because we need to develop energy infrastructure from scratch. And now the cost of renewables, the cost of solar, the cost of batteries has come down so much that often the most cost-effective way to build a new energy source from scratch is to start with distributed renewables.
Yeah, that's impressive. So even for factories, like you're starting a factory or a business and you think solar first than any other thing.
Yeah, exactly.
That's crazy.
So you'll go and you'll put let's take, factory is a great example. You're a factory outside of Abuja, Nigeria, and you're not getting maybe you are connected to the grid, but you're not getting reliable grid power, and you need to have your machines running 24/7. You're going to go, you've basically two options: a diesel generator, or a solar on your roof, solar and storage that can kick in whenever you need power. And the cost of solar has come down so much that now it's cheaper often than diesel, especially with rising diesel prices. And so solar is your best solution to have reliable power. And so that's sort of the world in which we work is, okay, there's this massive opportunity to build distributed renewable energy infrastructure as the infrastructure that's getting built. It's not kind of like it might be nice to have solar on my roof, or I can save a little bit of margin if I put solar, if I arbitrage the grid and use solar when grid pricing is higher or not. It really is sort of the solution to provide power. And then everything we're doing at Odyssey is basically how do we accelerate that potential.
That's awesome. Can you maybe explain a little bit more what do we mean when we talk about mini grids or microgrids? Because this is not just me and my factory having a solar panel and that's it. I'm part of a mini ecosystem, right? And that's sort of the beauty of it. But how do they work? If I want to do that, how do I go about it? I'm in Nigeria. I want to set up my business. And I think, okay, solar is more economical for me or makes more sense. What's next and how does it work?
Well, actually, so the way we kind of think about the distributed renewables market, there's three segments to it. On the smallest scale is residential solar. So very similar to the US, like you're putting solar on your rooftop to power your home. The second category is what we call commercial industrial or C&I solar. That's your factory that is probably putting solar either on its roof or nearby, either is totally off grid and relying just on that solar to power the factory, or is using a mix of that distributed renewable energy resource and the grid to make sure it's got reliable power. The third category is what we call mini grids. And that term typically applies to a community that doesn't have access to the grid at all, or is very underserved by the central utility grid. And so a mini grid is actually a mini power plant, probably solar, batteries, and maybe a diesel genset backup, and a distribution network that's connecting multiple what we call off-takers or multiple power users. So it's probably connecting to all of the households in a community plus all of the businesses and maybe a health clinic or a
And
factory or
who
whatever
sets
sort of.
that up? Like if I'm a factory owner, I need to know about the existence of these mini grid, or how do I go about it?
Yeah,
Or
so
if I want to have solar, I convince the others to turn into solar as well and try to come up with my own mini grid.
well, there can be a little bit of like a draw. There's a lot of draw from the power users, the off takers, right? A community
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, like we don't have access to power. Someone needs to come um, build this." But a lot of it also comes, especially in the work that we do, it comes from what we call project developers. So the companies that are building these assets and operating them and sort of bringing them to a place that they've identified is underserved by the grid, but has high potential to use power. Um, and what's interesting about that, again, it's a very different paradigm for energy infrastructure development than we have seen here in the US. Typically in the US, like we have these quasi-governmental organizations, utilities that run a big, centralized utility grid. In these markets, these are small local players that are acting like mini utilities, right? They might just own one or two or 20 mini grids, and they are responsible for identifying the site, for building the power
And these are
system, and then
private endeavors or public or a mix?
private companies. And that's what's been really interesting. There's been a regulatory shift realizing, okay, the central utility, sort of quasi-government utilities are not keeping up with energy demand, aren't building out the grid. And so we need to make it possible for private companies to sort of fill that gap. The best example of this is in South Africa, the um, the the main sort of central utility, Eskom, has had all of these challenges basically meeting energy demand. I mean, there's rolling blackouts every day. It's the first thing anyone will talk to you about when you're talking to someone in Cape Town or Joburg, because it's just such a pain point. The grid is hasn't been able to keep up with energy demand. And so what the government has done is said, okay, we acknowledge that Eskom isn't meeting demand. We're going to via regulations make it much easier for private companies to come in and fill the energy gap. And so they deregulated the licensing process for anything under 100 megawatts, which is actually really big. They've made it a lot easier for private companies to go just build those projects and provide power. And that's a trend that we're seeing across Africa because of this need for a paradigm shift of small private companies to be able to act as utilities, essentially.
And how do you solve with those mini grids the issue that we were talking about before when the US developed their own centralized grid? How do you solve the solar and wind being intermittent? How do you solve it here?
Well, you have storage.
That
You'll
is
have
the
a
key.
storage solution and then a diesel generator backup when if it's been cloudy for multiple days on end. Yeah.
Understood. That is the key then. And so you're hinting towards something in Africa, which is your main market, and in other emerging markets. And I think it's a good segue to talk about some of these mega trends within energy that might or might not have the same agenda, depending on you talk about energy access or clean energy. They might seem part of the same thing, but they might not be, right? If you think about, take whatever protocol or whatever agreement before Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, measure the energy consumption growth today, and it has gotten up, which is great news potentially for energy access, because most likely a lot of nations or regions that didn't have access to energy before, now they have, which is great for their economy. They can develop the same way developed nations did before. But on the flip side, if you look at the growth there, most likely 50% or so, I forget the exact number, is coming from fossil fuels. So that might seem to clash with clean energy. So how do you marry all of these mega trends within energy, and what's your view on each of them, or the most important ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it all comes down to economics, right? So I think the fundamental sort of trend that's helping renewables gain greater market share of overall energy infrastructure in emerging markets is the fact that it's often cheaper. It's cheaper to deploy that resource versus build a big power plant or build out a transmission grid. But not always, right? And so there is this tension of hey, for economic development in these countries, we have to have reliable power, right? You can't operate a growing economy without having reliable power. And so, if fossil fuels are a faster way to get there in certain contexts, like you can imagine that decision making sense. And that's where, I mean, it really comes down to global cooperation to price carbon, right? There's an externality that's not being priced in, and if you price that in, then distributed renewables are always going to make more sense than building out a big fossil fuel power plant.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But again, some people talk about energy and they choose to forget about what it means to support some of these regions in their economic development. Most likely it'll mean, getting comfortable with more fossil fuels for the next couple of years for sure. And that the decarbonization goals that we have are a bit unrealistic. And going back to our original comments on how dependent we are, we as developed nations and let alone emerging markets, on fossil fuels. And so I think that's an interesting, at least, contradiction in some of the mega trends that we're seeing within energy.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I mean, I think if we can really get sort of robust carbon markets going, it's going to make a huge difference. Again, I'm seeing this in Africa, where there's a number of projects that the unit economics don't quite pencil out. But if you had another revenue stream coming from developed countries, let's say corporations that are looking to decarbonize their supply chain, if they're buying renewable energy credits, if they're buying carbon credits from those assets, then the unit economics totally makes sense, and the project would move forward. And so I think that's part of it's a major piece of the puzzle, is that if we can really sort of make carbon markets more, just continue to expand them, make the pricing make sense, we'll see a lot more renewable energy development in emerging markets.
Emily, can you remind us of the importance of emerging markets within the broader energy landscape? And you were hinting towards it at the beginning of the conversation. We talked about you presenting to investors and having to remind them how big this opportunity is in emerging markets, in Africa, in energy. Like, just give us some sense of how big it really is.
Yeah, well, it's big in two ways. So one is in terms of sort of climate. Almost 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions growth is projected to happen in emerging markets. So if we're going to solve climate, we cannot ignore emerging markets. And that was a conversation I had a lot of, with climate investors specifically, because emerging markets is new for a lot of investors, as is climate investing. And so so I sort of had to remind investors, like, hey, if we're really going to move the needle on climate, we need to be investing in these markets. And we need, and what's interesting is that it's not, there's like very little technology risk, right? It's not like we need to be investing in cutting edge technologies in these markets to decarbonize them or suck carbon out of the air. It's really about, no, we just need to put these economies on a low carbon development track, right? With tried and true technologies, just with solar storage, things that we know work. It's more of a business model question. How do we make sure that the unit economics of these projects pencil out and that more and more of them can get built? But then the other opportunity is just simply that, trillions of dollars are going to be going into energy infrastructure in these markets, because there's a lack of energy infrastructure. And so if so much money is going to be poured into into energy infrastructure, let's make sure that money is being directed to the right type of energy infrastructure.
Totally. And so let's circle back to Odyssey now with hopefully we became experts in energy in 20 minutes. But what do you guys do more concretely now that we have more context on the region and some of the basic tenets?
Yeah, so I mean, Odyssey's sort of guiding mission is to accelerate the deployment of distributed renewable energy in emerging markets. So hopefully I've kind of laid out what the opportunity is and what the potential is. And our job is basically to help the market meet that potential. One of the dynamics of these markets is that, and I kind of described this a little bit earlier, but a lot of the companies that are building energy infrastructure projects in these markets are small to medium-sized enterprises. There's a lot of work that happens on the ground that you sort of need to be a local company to do. And so as a result, A, there's a lot of fragmentation in the market, and B, a lot of these companies aren't aren't benefiting from economies of scale. And so our thought behind Odyssey is, can we create
You're
a
talking
centralized...
about what you call the project developers, no?
Exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we call them renewable energy companies, and they're project developers. Another sort of category of company is what we call EPCs, engineering, procurement, and construction firms that are installing these projects. And so Odyssey, all of our product is basically oriented towards helping them scale faster. So we said, can we create a tech solution that takes some of the many challenges that they have off their plate, to streamline their development process and then help them get more projects off the ground in a given year. So our tech has tools for planning projects. So like, let's say you've got a shopping mall that you're trying to sell power to, and you want to convince them that solar makes sense. You can use our technology. You can use our tech to, size the system, tell them how much it's going to cost them, put together a proposal, that kind of thing. And then we have technology for streamlining the financing process, because a lot of what's holding back scale and potential of the sector is how kind of slow the project finance is in the sector. And a lot of that's just because it's a nascent sector that requires sort of a different paradigm for financing. When I was first kind of I started as a project developer myself, which is kind of the origins of Odyssey. And when I was doing that work, I was realizing, okay, so financiers, banks are looking at these projects and applying a framework that they're used to applying to utility scale projects, like $100 million big power plants. And that framework just doesn't work when you're trying to finance a portfolio of many small assets, right? Like you need standardization, you need a way to streamline the process. You need to understand every single asset within that portfolio, right? Because these are infrastructure projects you're developing, but you just can't spend millions of dollars looking at each individual asset, or else the whole project doesn't make sense. So we've built solutions to kind of streamline the process of evaluating and diligencing assets so that developers can get access finance more quickly. And then you move on to needing to procure your equipment. And the challenge that a lot of our customers have is that they're small buyers. And so they can't access equipment manufacturers directly. They are buying through local distributors and paying a much higher price. And so then the unit economics of these projects make a lot less sense. And so we built a digital marketplace to essentially aggregate lots of small buyers, become a big buyer, and give direct access to equipment manufacturers for things like solar, PV, and battery. And then finally, the last challenge is operating your assets. So now you've got a portfolio of assets. They're all over the place. They're small. You can't be sending someone out every time you want to check out what's going on. And so we have a full, what we call remote management and control technology, which allows operators to always kind of know what's going on with any solar project in their portfolio, and then also remotely control it. So if you want to be kind of optimizing the way that the system is running, you can turn things on and off from afar using our technology. You can set what we call logic loops, which are algorithms that optimize how the system, different components of the system interact with each other.
And is that a SaaS as well? That's a freemium SaaS, no?
Freemium SaaS, and then we have a small hardware component, sort of or a suite of them to enable the local communication with
it's impressive
the
platform that you guys are building. It has a lot of network effects on each of them, and a larger network effect for the entire network. Just to completely oversimplify what you guys are doing and just summarize what you just said, 2 SaaS components, one for the world banks or the financiers, if you want, that helps them streamline through standardized metrics, hopefully, and for them to be able to understand, okay, where do I before, if I'm analyzing a big project, I can spend a lot of money on due diligence and deep due diligence. Here you don't have the resources, it's not justifiable. So Odyssey helps you with that, or helps them with that. Then you have 2 marketplaces. You have the financing marketplace, just to help streamline that financing, which is one of the largest bottlenecks. And then you have the procurement marketplace for the project developers to be able to access all of those economies of scale of buying, at a better prices, solar panels or equipment or whatever they need. And then you have the operating component, you just said. That's Am I missing something? I obviously oversimplify.
Yeah, no, that's it. I mean, the way we talk about it is plan, finance, build, and operate your assets. So we have a sort of set of digital tools for each of those stages of project development.
That's awesome, Emily. And I've heard, I think it was Chamath, and maybe and lots of people talk about like the first trillionaire in the world will be made in climate change. If you had to make a prediction, which sector, and we've spoken about different sectors within energy and different mega trends, which sector do you think that will be, or which business model do you think will capitalize so much on this trend that will make the first trillionaire?
I don't know, honestly.
Of course not. Yeah.
I think like this may be a bit of a controversial opinion or a hot take, but I actually think we're focusing on the wrong thing if we're talking about how to become a trillionaire in climate change.
For sure.
Yeah. I mean, this is a global problem that's jeopardizing humanity's future generations. And I think it's a problem precisely because it's uneconomic, right? Like if this were wildly profitable today, we wouldn't be having this problem. But the problem that we've had is that it's been cheaper to build carbon intensive industries up until now. And so if we can sort of get the global collaboration and the right regulations and incentives in place, and we can price carbon, then we will have solutions to reduce it. But it's a long road there. I don't think it's sort of about just finding like the right tech or the right silver bullet. So yeah, I guess that's a bit of a dodge, but
no, I mean, it's so hard. If only we knew. Obviously, we don't have the crystal ball. But again, it goes back to when people invest in climate. It's so broad, and some of them you could be investing in conflicting things or conflicting views. So I think that's what I'm trying to do here, is to push people to think about what we really mean when we talk about climate tech. And there's so many.
Well, yeah, and I think the other trend that I would like to see, I think is happening, and I'd like to see more of, is the venture capital world getting more comfortable investing in things that are maybe outside of their comfort zone when they're looking at climate. Because what I saw a lot in my fundraising process was investors that had knew how to invest in SaaS companies, for example, knew how to invest in a certain type, or you guys know how to invest in marketplaces, and then are looking for climate solutions that fit that mold. And sometimes it works out, but climate is not going to be the same as e-commerce SaaS, right? Like it's got to have new solutions because it's a new type of problem. And so hopefully we'll see more versatility in sort of the types of business models that investors are starting to fund, which will give us a more breadth of solutions for actually solving the core problems.
That's great. Emily, can't thank you enough for this terrific conversation. Anything that you want to close with, any final messages before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I think I probably made this clear, but obviously I sort of view emerging markets as this huge opportunity. I think like Odyssey is playing its role in driving more capital into emerging markets, but they're so crucially important that I always encourage investors that maybe haven't traditionally invested in emerging markets to think about what it would take to kind of ramp and become comfortable in these new geographies that are just so critically important for climate change solutions.
Amazing.